Paul asked me to ask you, actually. I don't know if you know Paul Enns from Paulogia.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know him personally, but yeah.
You are without doubt the worst pirate I've ever heard of.
But you have heard of me.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, that's well-known Christian scholar, Dr. Mike Licona.
Welcome everyone to Deep Drinks Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Mike Licona, who is the professor of New Testament studies at Houston Christian University. He's a strong Christian and apologist who's debated the likes of Bart Ehrman on the resurrection many times, including a 7-hour debate.
Who wrote this giant book on the resurrection, though not as giant as Gary Habermas, with whom Mike co-wrote this skinny resurrection book. So many resurrection books. You have a new book that's recently come out. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, the title is Jesus Contradicted. I did not choose the title. I wanted a different one.
Mike is yet to say it, but I suspect that his publisher wanted to make this sound like a counter of sorts to the famous Bart Ehrman book, Jesus Interrupted. If so, that's good marketing. Deep Drinks podcast host, David McDonald, used the last portion of his time with Mike to ask the scholar about my minimal witnesses hypothesis. If you're a regular here, you may have seen my No Resurrection Required video explaining Mike's historical bedrock facts in naturalistic terms, or perhaps the critiques by renowned scholars Dr. Bart Ehrman.
I think you did extremely well. I mean, this kind of historical insight is rare.
Or Dr. Dale Allison.
So if you know the secondary literature and you're citing it and interacting with it, yeah, you get an A.
Or my recent short version summary I was invited to write for Bart Ehrman's website. We'll get to Mike's reaction in a minute, but first I wanted to point out an epistemological matter from the first hour and a half before they talked about me.
It's not just all about you, you know.
I think it goes without saying that when it comes to testimony, and testimony alone about a miraculous event, that it is more likely that the person is lying or that they are mistaken than that the event actually happened. People tell lies every day. People are mistaken about things every day. Miracles do not happen every day. As such, this is a reasonable starting point, which is why David specifically asks Mike about Hume's take on testimony.
It's in Hume on miracles. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless that testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. When anyone tells me that they saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision and always reject the greater miracle. So just taking that, like not all of Hume's work, I know he has some issues with other things, but just taking that, do you have issues with that methodology?
David's question is specifically about the value of testimony to determine a miracle. Will Mike give us an answer about testimony?
I do. And I think that's just a poor historical approach. And what's interesting is Hume was a historian, but he was really bad when it came to these kinds of things. So, I look at this and I say, okay, let's suppose we have some really good evidence that a miracle occurred. Okay. So I think we have that with the resurrection of Jesus. But let's just take another thing. Let's say that you've got a comet, or let's say I gave this example in my debate with Matt Dillahunty. Let's say that a Muslim terrorist came in and they said, Licona, this is while we're debating. Licona, you've argued that Islam is false, and so you must die. And they behead me right up there on stage, and everybody just flees the auditorium, leaving my headless corpse on the stage. And everybody flees, and the police are called.
Not at all. Mike gives a long, drawn-out hypothetical tale about coming back to life after a beheading in which none of the participants are asked to believe anything at all based on testimony. They are personal witnesses, and there is corroborating physical evidence everywhere. As such, this example in no way whatsoever provides any answer or objection to the notion of whether testimony can be sufficient evidence for a miracle.
Well, Mike, you don't have that kind of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. That's right. I agree. But we've got some pretty good evidence. We've got
testimony. You've got testimony, just testimony. It's frustrating when apologists try to impugn a particular epistemology with such disanalogies. Don't let them bait and switch like that. This is probably a good time to go to Mike's resurrection book and review the evidence that he does put forth, what he calls historical bedrock. This is from his summary of Chapter 4. We observed that there are 3 facts that are strongly supported by the data and are acknowledged as facts by a nearly unanimous and heterogeneous consensus of scholars who have studied the subject. 1. Jesus died by crucifixion. 2. Very shortly after Jesus' death, the disciples had experiences that led them to believe and proclaim that Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to them. 3. Within a few years after Jesus' death, Paul converted after experiencing what he interpreted as a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to him. These facts form the historical bedrock, facts past doubting, on which all hypotheses should be built. You might be surprised to hear that my main disagreement with Mike is with only one word of his statement here. Stay tuned for that.
I don't know if you know Paul Enns from Paulogia.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know him personally, but yeah.
He's a great guy, friend of the show. Great guy.
Big channel, I hear.
Yeah, he's a cool guy. And he recently wrote a blog on the Bart Ehrman blog called The Minimal Witnesses Naturalistic Hypothesis. Have you read it or have you heard it? Okay, so this is his idea for why to account for the growth of Christianity. And these are, I'll just run through the titles. We obviously don't have time to dive right into it, but I want to just get your first thoughts on it.
Due to time, David is going to have to speed run through the 12 mundane points that I think add up to a mundane explanation for Christianity and explain all of the minimal facts or historical bedrock that scholars like Mike or Gary Habermas put forth. I'll put a link in the description to the Minimal Facts playlist with the video version of my Bart Ehrman blog article, my initial No Resurrection Required presentation, and videos with scholars Bart Ehrman and Dale Allison going through point by point in more detail than Mike does.
So this is the hypothesis. So 1. In the early 1st century, among the apocalyptic preachers active in Judea was one Jesus of Nazareth. 2. This Jesus said or did controversial things which led to his crucifixion on the cross, a common practice at the time. 3. The resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers.
I would disagree
4.
with 3.
Okay,
so Mike disagrees with 3. No big surprise. But neither the burial of Jesus nor an empty tomb are claimed by Mike to rise to the level of historical fact, as he expresses in his work and other interviews.
Do you find that the empty tomb qualifies as part of the historical bedrock?
I don't. By far, the majority of scholars who grant the empty tomb are Christian scholars. And it doesn't come up to the level, even though it's a majority, if it's around 75%, that's a pretty strong majority. But I like it to be 90% or more for what I'm doing here. For my criteria for accepting something as historical bedrock.
For any 1st century crucifixion victim not named Jesus of Nazareth, Mike would agree that the body was disposed of by the Romans themselves, the victim's family and friends, or the Sanhedrin as a last resort.
It is true that was typically the typical practice of the Romans to do that.
If it's the Romans, they leave the bodies hanging, and eventually what's left goes in an unmarked mass grave. If it's the family, the disposal method would depend on the wealth and influence of the family. If it's the Sanhedrin, they're under strict regulation to use one of 2 separate criminal graveyards. If we can trust the Gospels that Jesus' remaining family was of modest means, of insufficient influence to get the body, and would not have had family plots in Jerusalem City, then Mike agrees that the family didn't get Jesus' body into a fancy Jerusalem tomb. If anyone not named Jesus would have ended up in an unremembered location under these circumstances, then it simply cannot be problematic to posit that Jesus likely ended up in an unremembered location under these circumstances. What usually happened doesn't bear the burden of proof. The unprecedented, one-of-a-kind, convenient, rich enemy-turned-friend who enters the story, then disappears from history before anyone can ask questions, is the scenario that bears the burden of proof. It's not controversial for me to say that what usually happened is likely what happened.
4. This Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but most disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard from again, all except Simon Peter and possibly John.
I mean,
we'll give that up.
he's going to have a number of followers that we don't know what happened to them. That can be said about any major figure, but no, I think we know about what happened to some more than that.
Yes, we know what happened to some, Simon Peter and possibly John. I wish Mike had given his list here to see whom else he has confidence in, because I haven't seen good evidence for any.
5. Distraught after death of his mentor, Simon Peter became sincerely, albeit mistakenly, convinced that Jesus had appeared to him. Of course, you disagree with that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say mistakenly, but certainly everybody would agree that Peter came to believe Jesus had appeared to him.
Sure, you wouldn't say mistakenly, but can you demonstrate that it wasn't mistakenly? A mistaken person behaves in exactly the same manner as a person who is correct. There's no word or action from Peter that demands he was correct in his belief, only that he held the belief.
James, the brother of Jesus, became part of Peter's Jesus movement, perhaps also one of the disciples named John. Stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism with a focus on recruiting new followers rather than accurately transmitting historical events.
Stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism with the focus on rather than accurately transmitting historical events. No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think that they were capable of reporting accurate history.
I didn't say they weren't capable of reporting accurate history. What I said is that winning converts was more important than accurate transmittal in those early days. Mike's new book is the result of 8 years of his research to show that the gospel writers can and did use literary devices to communicate ideas, taking liberties that no modern historian would, to effectively communicate the gospel message. Before that, there was 20 to 40 years of people just talking to each other. How much more pliable would the stories have been in those decades? There was evangelical evolution going on. Just by pure math, the version of the story that is most likely to convert a neighbor would have been the one that got spread more often, because those converted neighbors spread it. The most true didn't necessarily win the day.
You've got things like Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, who goes over some of the Jesus sayings at the Last Supper with the Eucharist. And then when Luke writes his gospel somewhere between 5 to 35 years later, it's virtually verbatim. So there was this Jesus tradition that was I think, was passed along in its integrity.
If the author of Luke was indeed a traveling companion of Paul, it would be unsurprising that he would include Paul's one and only direct quote of Jesus. Indeed, even if the author of Luke never met Paul, the Pauline letters were well known to the community before the Gospels were written, and that saying could have been cemented as part of the oral tradition merely by being in Paul's letters, or it emerged in the 20 years between that supper and Paul's writings. This observation by Mike of post-codification consistency doesn't reflect on the consistency of the story in the decades prior.
And that's why they had oral tradition as well. That's, you read this in the 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 through 7, that they passed on. I delivered to you what I also received. And he died, was buried, was raised, he appeared. And it follows the same kind of stuff that you find in the Gospels.
Again, granting that the brief outline of he died, was buried, was raised, and appeared emerged in the first 20 years after Jesus died and was generally adhered to decades later, doesn't speak to whether the decades of oral tradition were susceptible to pliability for evangelical purpose.
I mean, we could go on and things like that. And then you have the sermon summaries, which is considered to be summaries, charismatic summaries that we have encapsulated in Acts. Most scholars believe that too.
As we'll discuss, Mike and I would disagree considerably on the historical value of Acts. But even with my low value, I would agree that Acts may well be writing down the oral traditions about Jesus' followers. That tells me nothing about whether these traditions reflect actual sermons, or the extent to which they were changed in the telling.
8. Paul, Saul, a Pharisee who had been persecuting the new Christians out of sincere belief that they were serving God, experienced a non-veridical vision of the allegedly resurrected Jesus.
A non-veridical? I mean, it depends if you take the story of Acts. If you take the story of Acts seriously. And
I do not take the book of Acts seriously at all.
in Acts 9, 22 and 26, it talks about bystanders there that also participated in that experience. So that would be veridical if the story is true.
Mike is apparently not concerned that these stories contradict each other about that participation. In Acts 9, the companions hear the voice, but see no one. In Acts 22, the companions see the light, but hear nothing. In Acts 26, the companions fall down and do not see or hear anything. All in the same book. This doesn't inspire confidence for accuracy.
You can't just, maybe you just selectively look at the vision part, but selectively reject the other things that would nullify your hypothesis here.
I take Paul's own words about his vision seriously. It seems strange to prefer anonymous, second-hand at best reports instead. Paul doesn't talk about Damascus Road, or lights, or voices, or going blind, or any of it. He sticks to his guns on it being a vision that he can't quite describe, or even verify that it was in the body or out of the body. Remember, these stories and Acts are not part of Gary or Mike's facts that they defend. It seems that whenever someone posits better explanations for the facts, apologists retreat to the Bible. Of course, every naturalistic hypothesis has to contradict the Bible, otherwise it wouldn't be a naturalistic explanation. The question isn't, does it contradict the Bible? Does it contradict the actual facts? This is special pleading and goalpost shifting.
But that's a buffet style of criticism where you just pick the food you like and reject the rest just because it doesn't fit your mood at the time.
It's not. I stick to the consensus you provide, Mike. As such, I'm free to reject the Gospels and the Book of Acts.
You guys should have a discussion, I think. It'd be really, really interesting.
We have chatted once.
Good to meet you, Paulogia.
Good to meet you.
You had to have heard of him. I'm sure everybody hears of everybody.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
He's become a legend in the world of atheists.
But I'd love to do it again.
Paul met Peter and John, but they didn't see eye to eye.
That's true. On some things they didn't. You find in Galatians chapter 1, which is an undisputed letter of Paul, he goes up, he spends 15 days with Peter and also saw James, the brother of Jesus at that time. But in Acts chapter 2, they go up there and he runs the gospel message past them. This is in verses 1 through 10. Runs the gospel message past the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John, to ensure that he's on message with what they're preaching.
The context of what Paul is concerned about in Galatians 2 is entirely about whether adult Gentile men needed to become circumcised in order to become Christians. It's obvious from context that Paul is checking his teaching about freedom from the law, not details about the resurrection. Paul disagreed with Peter and James on the law dispute, and 2 verses later, Paul affirms that he won the dispute. These men added nothing to my message, and affirms the context again, that his task was preaching to the circumcised, nothing about the resurrection. To try to make this meeting about resurrection is injecting content that simply isn't there. If Paul cared about affirming historical details of Jesus' life, death, and burial, he sure doesn't express it. As far as we can tell, Paul didn't care.
And he says they extended the right hand of fellowship and didn't add anything to what he said.
Yes, the Jerusalem apostles capitulated to Paul.
So when it comes to the gospel message itself, the essentials of the Christian faith, they were in agreement.
The passage simply does not say that. It says nothing about the essentials Mike is reading in. They came to an agreement about circumcision requirement.
It's not until a few verses later.
How much time lapsed between paragraphs?
That Paul talks about how after that event, Peter came and visited them in Antioch, and there were some of men of James. They seemed to be legalists who were insisting that the Jews continue with the Jewish law at that point. And so Peter refuses to eat in the same room as the Gentile Christians. And this is where Paul rebukes Peter to his face.
Indeed.
But later on, we find Peter accepting Gentiles, if Acts 15 is correct.
I do not think Acts is correct.
He's now accepting Gentiles into the fold. He understands this because he says God revealed that to him. So, yeah, they had some theological misunderstandings at some point, but it seems like they resolved those things.
Just one of many reasons why scholars view Acts as a post hoc effort by someone to portray Peter and Paul as if they were on the same page, despite Paul's letters painting a different picture.
10. Several decades later, Greek-speaking individuals who had never met Jesus or Peter began documenting and circulating stories about Jesus, the sayings attributed to him, and their interpretations of these narratives.
Yeah, again, as we talked about earlier, I do think that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the traditional authors, I think there's decent evidence that the traditional authors are behind those Gospels.
I'll point you to my video, Who Really Wrote the Gospels, for the case against the traditional authorship. Decent evidence that convinces few skeptical scholars isn't a fact on the table. Again, he's bringing in an unsupported detail to object.
And yes, they probably used Greek-speaking secretaries to write these things down, and Greek was the lingua franca of that day. So you would if you want to reach the world, you want to do it in the language that everybody can understand, or the most people can understand.
I mention it in my hypothesis explicitly because so few people seem to understand that the Gospels were written in a different language than what Jesus and apostles would have spoken. I don't think your secretary explanation is sufficient, but I'm glad you at least agree on the premise.
Cool.
Paul was a Jew, and he wrote in Greek, right? He wrote in Greek.
Yes, Paul wrote in Greek, but Paul wrote no Gospels. He was dead before the first Gospel was written. David and Mike aren't reading all the text of my article, so I can give Mike a pass on this. But even what they did read, stories about Jesus, as we've said, Paul generally doesn't care about the life of Jesus. Sayings from Jesus, Paul has but one. As far as we know, Paul never met Jesus, so not a particularly relevant objection, if it was meant as one.
11. Occasionally, some early Christians engage in disruptive behavior and face consequences as a result. That's pretty
politically,
everyone can agree with that.
Yeah.
And 12, centuries later in 303
and hold on a second, that disruptive behavior we're talking about in the early church, that'd be among some of the Jews, where the Jewish leaders, they were the ones protesting the Christians in the synagogues, and finally the Christians were excommunicated. And the Jewish leaders were causing a lot of problems at that point. So then you got to say, well, who was causing the disruptive behavior? Was it the Christians or was it the Jewish leaders at that time? And I'm not anti-Semitism here.
Everyone knows it can't be anti-Semitic if you say it's not anti-Semitic.
So, to be clear, I sometimes reference the geopolitical complexities of the topic, which is not the same as going to an anti-Semitic place.
I have no stake in this.
I don't either.
It's not anti-Semitic here because these people, Paul and the early Christians, were Jews.
To be clear, I don't think Mike is being anti-Semitic. I just thought he used humorous phrasing.
No homo.
So you have that. And the Romans started putting them to death because what they were saying is the Romans didn't care if you believed in your own God.
Oddly, I think might be helping my greater point on this point. And that is that this notion that people were putting their necks on the line just by saying they were Christians is a highly exaggerated notion and serves of no guarantee of the truth or even the sincerity of the beliefs of early Christians.
What got the Christians in trouble was they're saying Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. And they refused to bow the knee to Caesar, and that's what got them executed and why the Romans called them atheists.
I'd encourage you to read The Myth of Persecution by Candida Moss and Triumph of Christianity, How a Forbidden Religion Swept the World by Bart Ehrman. Mike's right that the Romans did call Christians atheists, but wrongthink wasn't a primary reason for the sporadic, though obviously still unfortunate, troubles for Christians.
And number 12, centuries later in 303 AD, Christianity was temporarily outlawed in Rome, but it gained legal protection 10 years later and soon became the Roman Empire's first official religion, marking its transformation towards the institution we know today.
Okay.
So, all right, you've obviously you need to look more, read the other text in this, and Paul's got a video on this. Give us a percentage. What is the percentage chance you think that holds water?
0. And I'm not
0%.
I'm not just trying to say that. I mean, there's a lot of wrong with what he just said.
To recap, Mike's objections were Jesus' body landed in a remembered spot, not one of his facts, and entirely for the Bible tells me so. Mike thinks he can reliably say more about the post-Jesus activities of the 12 beyond Peter and John, unfortunately not hinting at which ones or how. I think Peter's belief was mistaken. Mike thinks it wasn't, for unspecified reasons. If this is just a matter of opinion, then we're at an impasse, since again, the actions of a person with a mistaken belief are identical to the actions of a person with a correct belief. The motivation is identical. That the apostles were correct about their beliefs isn't one of Mike's facts. Mike thinks that none of the people spreading the stories about Jesus were favoring evangelistic goals over historical goals, and that runs entirely counter to my intuition on the matter. Since we're talking about the period before things were written down, you'll have to use your own judgment. But again, decades of perfectly unembellished oral tradition isn't one of Mike's facts. Again, I posit that Paul's vision was non-veridical, and Mike thinks that it was veridical, because the 3 conflicting tellings of the story in Acts give vague hints. That Paul's vision was really Jesus is not one of Mike's facts. We agree that the Jerusalem Council happened. We disagree on what was discussed. Mike's interpretation is assuming things the text does not actually say. My interpretation is the plain contextual reading without adding to it. That Peter and Paul agreed on things isn't one of Mike's facts. Mike finds, quote, decent evidence for traditional authorship of the Gospels. I'm in line with all the non-evangelical scholars who doubt traditional authorship. Traditional authorship is not one of Mike's facts. These are not fatal objections. So 0? Really?
So
okay.
When you get some of these major pillars wrong, that just kind of that just destroys the overall hypothesis.
Okay, you're saying I got major pillars wrong, but none of these objections have to do with your historical bedrock. My hypothesis does not contradict your historical bedrock in any way. Rather, it fully explains the historical bedrock without needing to posit anything supernatural. Your work says nothing about having to explain these arbitrary major pillars that seem instead to be shifting goalposts.
What do you think is the main problem? What would bring it from a 0% to a 1%?
I'd have to go back and look at the 12 or 13 points again, but yeah. I mean, just some of them were just outright wrong.
Outright wrong. All of the objections you expressed were just a difference of opinion or interpretation on topics where I align fully with scholars in the field. How is that outright wrong? Now, I'll grab that you didn't have time to think or do any more than react on the spot to something you've never seen before. So maybe your main objections went unstated. Maybe we could have a conversation about it sometime.
Okay, interesting. I'd love to see a conversation between you guys.
Again, I'd love to have another friendly talk with Mike about this stuff. I respect Mike, and he seems like a great guy. So now you might be wondering about the one word in Mike's historical bedrock list where he and I disagree. It's actually the word the. Mike says, very shortly after Jesus' death, the disciples had experiences that led them to believe and proclaim that Jesus had been resurrected and appeared to them. The phrase the disciples gives the mistaken impression that scholars are agreeing that all 12 of the 12 are well evidenced here. Skeptical scholars do not grant that all 12 of the 12 or 11 of the 11. Saying the disciples smuggles in agreement where there is not agreement. To create historical bedrock, Mike should change this to some disciples, or I think more accurately, one or more disciples. Mike's book does not attempt to justify them all by name, and his objection today was more than 2. That's not all of them.
The disciples and Paul had experiences that they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus to them, and they believed he'd been raised physically, bodily from the dead. Even Ehrman acknowledges that. You even have an enemy of the church who was biased in the opposite direction who came to this conclusion. So now you've got to look at, and these happen now, not everybody, but by a very large majority will agree that some of these experiences happen with groups, which rules out group hallucinations.
Obviously, enough people disagree that you didn't make group appearances a fact, and I'd love to see the numbers on this large majority. Is it a heterogeneous majority, or is it just the evangelicals, who happen to make up the majority of people who publish on related topics? Obviously, I disagree strongly that there were any group appearances, and Mike agrees I'm not the only one.
I'm not the only one.
Now, what about the groups? Because hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an individual, they have no external reality.
Something to worry about once you sufficiently demonstrate that there were group appearances.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We have your book, obviously. People should go check it out. Jesus Contradiction.
I'm looking forward to checking out Mike's new book. It's a study of literary devices used in ancient biographies and the comparison of the use of these literary devices in the Gospels. Some Christians are very much going to have a problem with admitting that some parts of the Gospels were using devices to tell a story rather than literal truth. And this floodgate might potentially open up other acceptable biographical practices of the day, like deification of fallen leaders and hero story one-upsmanship. Stay tuned.
You also have a YouTube channel.
I do. In fact, you're watching it right now. I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, if you haven't already, so that you're better notified when new videos come out. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, later.